People think betrayal has a sound, a scream, a door slam, a sentence that detonates the room. Mine didn't. Mine came in the soft click of a rehab room door, the sterile smell of disinfectant, and my husband standing there like he was about to return a sweater, calm, impatient, already gone. I was still in a wheelchair. My legs still felt like they belonged to someone else. My hands still shook from pain meds and humiliation because I couldn't even move from the chair to the bed without planning it like a military operation. And Liam, my husband, didn't sit. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't even pretend. He stood near the door with his gym bag hanging from his shoulder, eyes sliding past me like he couldn't afford to look too long. "I want a divorce," he said. Just like that. I remember blinking at him, thinking I'd misheard. Like maybe my brain, still bruised from the accident, had rearranged his words into something crueler. "A what?" My voice came out thin. He exhaled like I was making this harder than it needed to be. "I've thought about it. I can't do this." "Do what?" I asked, and even as I said it, my throat tightened, because I already knew. He glanced down at my wheelchair, like it was evidence. "Live like this. Take care of someone who might never walk again." My stomach dropped so fast I felt nauseous. There are moments when your body reacts before your mind does. My palms went cold. My heart started thudding, like it was trying to escape my ribs. I swallowed. "Is there someone else?" He didn't deny it. He shrugged, almost casual, like I'd asked if he'd eaten yet. "There's a trainer at the gym, Isabella." The room tilted. I gripped the armrest so hard my knuckles ached. "How long?" "A while," he said, and his tone suggested the timeline didn't matter, because in his head, the decision was already final. I tried to breathe through the burn in my lungs. "Liam, I'm getting better. The doctors—" He cut me off. "You don't understand what you're asking me to sign up for." Then he said the sentence that still wakes me up some nights, even years later. "I'm not spending my life changing bedpans and pushing a wheelchair." I stared at him, unable to blink, because I was terrified that if I did, I'd cry, and if I cried, he'd win by turning my pain into inconvenience. He adjusted the strap of his gym bag and looked right at me. "I deserve better," he said. "Someone who can provide properly." And then he left. 5 years later, when I finally rebuilt my life, when my career finally took off and I started making real money, Liam came back. Not with regret. With obsession. With fake accounts, blocked numbers, and a private investigator. And the first time my doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon and I saw his face on my security camera, I realized the divorce hadn't been the ending. It had only been the intermission. My name is Leah Dawson. I'm 35 now, and if you met me today, you'd probably assume I've always been this composed. This woman who answers emails in full sentences, who leads meetings without apologizing for taking up space, who walks into a room with a cane and still somehow makes people step aside like the cane is a crown instead of a scar. But that version of me didn't exist when I was 22. At 22, I was all soft edges and survival. I lived in Gresham, in a town that felt like it was constantly damp. Rain in the air, rain in the pavement cracks, rain in the way people spoke like they were always bracing for something. I worked as an electrical apprentice for a commercial contracting company, the kind of job that leaves dust under your nails no matter how hard you scrub. I liked it because it made sense. Wires go here, current flows there, problems have causes, and causes can be fixed. People didn't treat emotions that way. That's what drew me to Liam. We met in the most unromantic place possible, a diner off a road where trucks always seemed to be passing through. I'd come in after a job site, hair tucked under a beanie, hoodie smelling like insulation, shoulders aching from dragging ladders and carrying spools. Liam was there with friends, laughing too loud, the kind of laugh that dared you to look. He was handsome in an easy way, clean, confident, a little smug without being cruel. He watched me while I waited for my coffee. Not like a creep, like he'd made a decision. When the waitress, Lillian, called my order, I picked up the cup, turned, and nearly collided with him because he'd walked up too close. "Careful," he said, and smiled like he'd just saved me from a disaster instead of a coffee spill. "Thanks," I replied, and I remember thinking, he's practiced at this. Still, I liked the attention. I was young. I was tired. And it felt good to be noticed, like I was something more than a body that could crawl through attics. He asked for my number right there, bold as if rejection had never happened to him before. And I gave it. We dated for about 8 months. 8 months sounds short, but when you're 22 and you've never had stability, it feels like a whole era. Liam and I didn't do grand gestures. We did cheap movie nights, shared fries, late drives with the windows cracked. We did grocery lists and gas receipts. We did tired kisses in parking lots. We also did something else, something that mattered more than I realized at the time. We did speed. Not reckless party speed, life speed. After 8 months, we got married at a courthouse. No fancy ceremony, no white dress moment. Just me in a simple outfit I'd bought with my own paycheck and Liam in a button-down that still had the tag crease. 2 witnesses. A judge who looked like he'd done this 5 times already that morning. A few signatures, a few forced smiles for a photo we never framed. Everyone asked why we moved so fast. We told them the safe answer. Love, timings, it felt right. The truth was uglier and simpler. We were both young and wanted to feel chosen. We rented a small house on the east side of town, cheap because the roof leaked and the heater barely worked in winter. The kind of house where you could hear the wind through the window frames, where the floorboards creaked like they were complaining. But we made it work. We didn't have big dreams. We weren't that couple saving for some perfect future. We were just existing. I worked long hours, running wiring through commercial buildings, crawling in attics where the air tasted like old insulation. I'd come home with my back tight and my hands scraped up, and Liam would be on the couch, scrolling his phone, asking what was for dinner, like the question was casual instead of heavy. He worked too for a while, nothing glamorous. He'd do shifts, complain about management, talk about how he was meant for bigger things. In the beginning, I believed him, because he believed himself, and confidence is contagious when you don't have much else. There wasn't much romance after the first year, but there wasn't much conflict either. We didn't fight dramatically. We didn't throw things. We simply coexisted. That was our marriage. 2 people sharing a space, paying bills, making meals, going to the occasional movie on weekends, like we were roommates who sometimes kissed. And here's the part that still makes me feel stupid when I say it out loud. I thought coexisting meant stability. I thought quiet meant safe. I didn't realize quiet can also mean someone is already halfway out the door. Liam joined a gym around that time. At first, I was happy for him. He said he wanted to get healthier. He said he wanted a routine. He said he felt stuck, and the gym helped him feel like he was improving something. I nodded, kissed his cheek, told him I was proud. I didn't question why he started staying later. I didn't question why he began caring more about his appearance than our home falling apart. I didn't question the way he'd come back smelling like a different soap, or the way he'd smile at his phone like he had a private joke I wasn't part of. Because I didn't want to be that wife, the suspicious one, the one who ruins the peace with paranoia. So I did what I always did. I focused on work. I focused on being useful. I focused on keeping things running. And then, when I was 25, a Tuesday afternoon erased everything I thought I knew about my life. I was driving home from a job site when a delivery truck ran a red light and hit my car on the driver's side. I don't remember the crash. I don't remember the sound. I don't remember the moment my body became something fragile. What I remember is waking up to a world that felt muffled, like I was underwater. A doctor explaining that my injuries were severe, that I was lucky to be alive, that my chances had been around 10%. 10%. I was 25 and suddenly my future wasn't modest anymore. It was uncertain. The damage to my spine meant I couldn't walk. They said maybe, with intense physical therapy, I could regain some function. But there were no guarantees. They used the phrase permanent disability, like it was a label they could apply and then move on. I stayed in the hospital for 3 months. According to the nurses Liam visited while I was in the coma. After I woke up, his visits became thin. Twice the second month, once the third. And every time I asked, "Has my husband called?" the answer was usually no. The person who showed up more than Liam did wasn't even family. It was my coworker, Pete. Pete brought magazines. He read them out loud because I couldn't hold them yet. He cracked jokes at the worst times just to make me smile. He adjusted my blanket when I shivered. He talked to me like I was still Leah, not just a broken body in a hospital bed. I told myself Liam was busy. I told myself he was scared. I told myself love doesn't always look pretty in a crisis. Then, one Thursday afternoon, during my last week, Liam walked into my rehab room holding his purse of excuses like he'd rehearsed them on the drive over. And he said the sentence that cut deeper than the accident ever did. I want a divorce. And that was the first time I understood. The crash didn't break my life. It just revealed what was already cracked. When people talk about betrayal, they usually point to a moment. A text discovered, a kiss witnessed, a confession overheard. But real betrayal doesn't usually announce itself. It prepares. Looking back now, the signs were there long before the accident, small enough to ignore, quiet enough to excuse, familiar enough to feel normal. Liam didn't change overnight. He withdrew, slowly, methodically, in ways that didn't seem dramatic enough to call out. Before the accident, there were evenings when I came home exhausted, my body aching from hours of physical labor, only to find him already dressed to leave. "Jim," he'd say, grabbing his keys. I'd nod, forcing a smile. "Have fun?" He stopped asking how my day went. He stopped noticing when I came home limping or with bruises blooming across my arms. He started eating before I got home, stopped waiting, stopped syncing his life to mine. And I told myself that was normal. People need space. People grow. Marriage isn't fireworks all the time. But there was a new energy around him, lighter, sharper. He'd stand in front of the mirror longer. He bought new clothes when money was tight. He'd come home smelling like citrus soap I didn't recognize. When I asked about it once, casually, he laughed. "What? Am I not allowed to smell clean now?" The way he said it made me feel foolish for even asking. So I stopped. Another thing I didn't question enough was how his complaints shifted. At first, it was about work. Then it was about me, but never directly. He'd say things like, "I just don't want to end up stuck," or "I can't live a small life forever." He never said, "You're holding me back." He didn't have to. Then came the accident. And that's when the conflict stopped being subtle. While I was unconscious, lying in a hospital bed with tubes and machines, doing the work my body couldn't, Liam was already reimagining his future. After I woke up, I noticed how uncomfortable he looked around medical equipment, how he avoided eye contact with nurses when they spoke about long-term care, how his jaw tightened when physical therapists explained the uncertainty of my recovery. He'd nod politely, but his eyes would drift to the door. And every time he left early, I told myself it was compassion fatigue, that caring for someone broken was hard, that love sometimes falters before it finds its footing again. But there was one moment that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. A nurse, kind, gentle, asked Liam if he'd be able to help me at home once I was discharged. Things like transfers, medication reminders, accessibility modifications. Liam smiled tightly and said, "We'll figure it out." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the wall. After that, his visits dropped sharply. The second month, he came twice. The third month, once. Each time, I watched the clock while he was there, counting the minutes like they mattered more to him than I did. When I asked if he'd called, nurses gave me sympathetic looks they tried to hide. One of them squeezed my hand once and said, "You have people who care." She meant Pete, because Pete kept showing up. Pete helped me feel human when my husband couldn't. That contrast between who stayed and who disappeared started planting something dark inside me, a question I didn't want to ask. What if he's already gone? The day Liam finally came to the rehab center really came, not just stopping by like an obligation. Something in his posture told me it wasn't a good visit. He stood instead of sitting. He didn't touch me. He didn't ask about therapy. And when he told me about Isabella, the trainer from his gym, he didn't look ashamed. He looked relieved, like he was finally saying the thing he'd been holding back. That's when I realized something else, something colder and harder to accept. He didn't just leave because I was disabled. He left because disability exposed how conditional his love had always been. Still, even after he said it, after he reduced my worth to my ability to walk and earn, I begged. I told him I'd get better. I told him the doctors were optimistic. I told him I could forgive the affair if he stayed. That's not something I'm proud of. But trauma shrinks your sense of self. It makes survival feel like bargaining. And Liam knew that. He knew exactly how vulnerable I was, which is why he felt comfortable saying, "I deserve better." And leaving me there, still in a wheelchair, still healing, still believing marriage meant something, while he walked out to a life he thought would be easier. The conflict didn't explode that day. It rooted itself. And it would keep growing, quietly, dangerously, for years. The moment didn't happen in a dramatic slam or a shouted confession. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in a rehabilitation facility that smelled like antiseptic and pity. I was just beginning to get the hang of transferring from my wheelchair to the bed on my own, muscles screaming with every motion, heart pounding with fear and determination. The air was thick with humidity from the heaters and the faint odor of latex gloves. My body was a map of bruises, burns, and scars. Evidence of survival, yes, but also proof that life had decided I wasn't going to get the future I'd imagined. And then Liam walked in. I remember how the sunlight fell across the room through the blinds, catching dust particles in midair, and how his shadow stretched over the linoleum floor as he stood by the door. His posture was rigid, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, and yet there was a casualness to the way he looked at me, as if nothing extraordinary were about to happen. "I want a divorce," he said without preamble. No hesitation, no softening, just those words, like knives sheathed in silk. The sound of it echoed in my skull. My ears rang. My vision blurred at the edges, not from my injury, but from shock. I tried to understand, to process. "Liam, you're serious?" My voice came out thinner than I intended, cracking under the weight of disbelief. He shrugged and smiled faintly, not cruelly, just indifferent. "I've thought about it extensively. I can't see a future where I take care of someone who might never walk again." The words hit me physically. My stomach twisted, my chest constricted, my heart felt like it had been shoved down a flight of stairs. The nausea clawed at my throat. Every instinct screamed, "This isn't real. He's joking." But the steady, calm look in his eyes told me the truth. He wasn't. I tried to bargain, to reason, to appeal to the life we'd shared. "The doctors say I'll improve. I can do the therapy. I can—" "You don't understand," he interrupted. His voice was steady, unflinching. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to tell you. I'm done." And then he dropped the final bomb, the name. "Isaac," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational, like he was talking about the weather instead of confessing betrayal. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. My legs, useless, unresponsive, felt heavier than ever. My hands gripped the chair's armrests until my knuckles turned white. Who is Isaac?" I managed to whisper. "The trainer, at the gym. We've been seeing each other," he said, the words coming out like he was reading from a grocery list. It wasn't a slap, it wasn't a punch. It was a scalpel, precise and cold. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to throw something. My body trembled, not just from weakness, but from the betrayal that had just sunk its claws into my chest. "Do you understand what you're saying?" I asked, voice shaking, lips trembling. "You're leaving me for someone else while I can't even stand on my own 2 feet?" He didn't answer with words. He simply looked past me, as if I were a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. "I deserve better," he said, echoing the sentence that would haunt me for months. Then he left, and the room, once filled with the soft beeps of monitors and the muted chatter of nurses, fell into a silence so loud it pressed down on my skull. I wanted to curl up, to disappear into the wheelchair, to make myself invisible, but part of me, small, stubborn, furious, wanted to fight. Not him, not yet. I wanted to fight the betrayal itself, the reality that someone I had trusted could reduce love to convenience. That day planted the seed that would grow into a storm that would test every part of me, my body, my mind, my heart. I realized for the first time that he had never been my partner in the way I thought he was, and the true battle had just begun. I spent that evening in silence, the wheelchair parked awkwardly in the center of the small rehab room, my hands pressed into the armrests so tightly my nails dug crescent-shaped grooves into the plastic. The hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights felt deafening, each flicker a reminder of how exposed I was, physically, emotionally, irreversibly. The nurses had left hours ago. Pete had gone home. Only me, my racing heartbeat, and the knowledge that the person who had promised to be my partner had walked out, leaving my life in pieces. Shock wasn't polite. It didn't follow a neat, cinematic arc. It hit like a tidal wave in fits and starts. I could breathe, then couldn't. My stomach twisted, my vision blurred, my throat felt raw. But worst of all was the emptiness, the dissonance between the person I had loved and the one standing at the door that day. I replayed his words endlessly in my head. I deserve better. Someone who can provide properly. The words clung to me like sticky residue, impossible to wipe away. My fingers itched to dial, to yell, to demand answers, but the wheelchair reminded me how helpless I felt in that moment. My body, my mind, my will, all still tethered to the accident, still fragile, still dependent. I couldn't rationalize it. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't make it go away. All I could do was sit and stare at the wall, trying to locate some trace of myself in the room that had become both my sanctuary and my prison. I thought about the months we had shared before the accident, the 8 months of dating, the courthouse wedding, the cheap rented house with the leaky roof, the long days of work and quiet evenings. I remembered our small routines, The early morning coffee, the weekend movies, the laughter that felt like warmth, even on dreary days. And I realized how quickly all of that could vanish, how fragile the illusion of love could be. I started questioning myself over and over. Did I miss the signs? Did I ignore the subtle withdrawals, the lingering glances at someone else, the way he stopped asking about my day? My mind played these memories in slow motion, dissecting every interaction, looking for fault lines I hadn't noticed. The guilt was suffocating because somewhere deep down I felt responsible, not for his actions, but for believing in a life that had never been guaranteed. When I finally allowed myself to cry, the tears were not just for him. They were for me, for the loss of my independence, for the stolen months of recovery that should have been supported, not abandoned, for the trust that had been folded neatly and tossed aside like an empty coat. Later, Pete visited. He found me curled on the bed, trembling. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside me, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. No judgment, no advice, just presence. And in that moment, I understood that reaction isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about endurance. Sometimes it's about gathering strength quietly while the storm rages around you. I knew I had to face reality. I had to navigate my new life in a wheelchair with the knowledge that the person I had counted on had chosen someone else. But I also felt the spark, the smallest ember of defiance, flicker in my chest. I won't let this define me. I won't let him decide what I am worth. The first confrontation, when it came, wasn't explosive. I asked him about Isabella, about the reasons, about whether any part of him regretted walking away. He looked at me like I was a curiosity he'd examined and discarded. The conversation ended quickly. No apologies, no explanations that mattered, just the cold, hard fact that the marriage was over. And I sat there, still in the wheelchair, staring at my own hands, feeling the raw weight of betrayal settle into every muscle, every bone. For the first time, I realized that recovery wouldn't just be physical. It would be emotional, mental, spiritual. And it would start by facing the truth I had been too afraid to acknowledge. I had been abandoned. But I also realized something else. In the chaos, in the emptiness, in the pain, there was the first flicker of control. The realization that I still had myself, that even broken, even betrayed, I could choose how to rise. The weeks after that first confrontation were a storm I hadn't anticipated. Liam's absence had been a wound. Now, his absence collided with a barrage of interference from his family, his friends, and the echo of a life that had once been ours. His parents, Robert and Michelle, arrived at the rental house the day after he left. They brought groceries, cleaning supplies, and a sense of concern that was almost painful to witness. Robert, tall and solid, moved through the apartment, installing grab bars in the bathroom, checking that doorways were clear, measuring distances for a wheelchair-accessible layout. Michelle organized my medications, labeling everything carefully, setting up a schedule on the kitchen counter. Their gestures were kind, almost frantic, but they carried a silent judgment. Their daughter had left me when I needed her most. I thanked them, of course. I smiled. I tried to focus on the practical tasks at hand, but every interaction with them was tinged with the tension of what hadn't happened. The love, the care, the commitment I had expected from Liam. Their concern reminded me that I had been abandoned, and the sting burned sharper than any injury. Then there were the whispers, subtle at first, that crept through social circles. Liam's friends and coworkers began sending messages, indirectly questioning my progress, commenting on my recovery with veiled doubt. "Are you sure she'll make it? Do you think she can handle it alone?" Each message was like a small cut, an echo of doubt that mirrored the betrayal I felt. People I had trusted to be neutral were now amplifying his absence and his decision, and I felt a weight pressing down on every decision I made. Meanwhile, physical therapy was relentless. My body screamed at every attempt to stand, to balance, to walk with a cane. My muscles burned, my joints ached, but the hardest part wasn't the pain. It was having to do it, knowing he had already moved on, that he had found someone new while I fought to reclaim my life. Then came the financial complications. Liam had initially attempted to claim part of the settlement from the accident, expecting to leverage my vulnerability. But my lawyer had ensured he signed documents waiving any claim, hastening the divorce. Even so, the process was exhausting. Every interaction, every signature, every discussion with attorneys reminded me of the tangled consequences of his departure. As if the personal and the practical weren't enough, evidence of betrayal kept appearing like cruel reminders. Emails, messages from friends, hints dropped in conversations, all pointing to his new relationship with Isabella. Photos, casual mentions, even her name tattooed in my mind, because he spoke it with a smile while I was in pain. Every week, the tension escalated further. Robert and Michelle's visits, while helpful, carried an undercurrent of guilt on my side and unspoken frustration on theirs. Liam's friends would mention him casually in conversation, often with the expectation that I should feel grateful for what had been. And at the rehabilitation center, colleagues and nurses whispered, perhaps trying to offer comfort, perhaps out of curiosity, "Are you okay? How is Liam handling things?" As if he were still the center of my world. I began to notice changes within myself, where I had once tolerated the passive comments, the veiled judgments, I now bristled. Where I had once ignored the whispering and gossip, I now documented, recorded, and prepared. Every subtle slight, every reminder of betrayal became data, evidence that would fuel my eventual clarity. And the hardest change of all? Emotionally, I was no longer the same woman who had begged him to stay. I felt a quiet steel forming beneath the tremors, a resolve hardening like concrete around a fragile core. The conflict, the abandonment, the gossip, it wasn't just assaulting me from the outside, it was forcing me to redefine myself from the inside. By the time I left the rehabilitation facility, I could walk short distances with a cane. But more importantly, I had begun walking inside myself, through the corridors of doubt, past the doors of betrayal, into a space where I was no longer only a victim, but a survivor, quietly preparing for the day I would reclaim my life. The escalation wasn't just about Liam or his affair, it was about everything. The people who had failed me, the systems that made me fight twice as hard, and the emotional reckoning that demanded I grow stronger, smarter, and unyielding. By the time the third month after my discharge arrived, I hit a low I hadn't imagined possible. I was alone in the small apartment Liam had abandoned, the walls echoing with silence and the faint scent of bleach and dust. The wheelchair sat parked where he had last seen me, my cane propped against the wall, useless without the strength I once took for granted. Every step I took in physical therapy left my muscles screaming and my heart questioning why I had to endure this at all. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the loneliness, the quiet, suffocating realization that the person who had promised partnership had chosen convenience over love, and that the people who were supposed to support me, Liam's circle, friends we had shared, had already shifted to his side, whispering doubts, justifying his choices. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, knees tucked to my chest, hands gripping the thin blanket, feeling the emptiness press down like water in a deep well. The thought that no one truly understood what I was going through gnawed at me. Nurses were compassionate, but overworked. Pete visited when he could, but he wasn't family, and even his presence was fleeting. Emails arrived, small but pointed. News of Liam and Isabella, their casual photos, invitations to events he never bothered to mention, as if flaunting that life he had chosen over me. My stomach churned every time a notification popped up. It wasn't just jealousy. It was grief for what had been erased. I questioned everything about myself. Was I not enough? Was my life now defined by what I lost? Am I broken beyond repair? I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped, swallowed by the walls that had witnessed my helplessness. I wanted to cry, but the tears seemed to stick in my chest, too heavy to fall. Every night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the hum of the heater and the occasional siren outside, imagining a future I couldn't reach. The thought of rebuilding alone was terrifying. The thought of stepping into a world where Liam had moved on, and I was still trapped in this fragile body, made me feel like disappearing entirely might be easier than fighting. I even wondered if I'd ever walk normally again, or if my life would always be this liminal space between what was and what could have been. Every small setback in therapy, every ache in my legs, every moment of fatigue felt like confirmation that I had failed. But even in that darkness, there was a flicker, so tiny I almost missed it. I realized that the despair wasn't permanent, that the very act of surviving, waking up, facing the room, pushing myself through therapy, was proof that I hadn't surrendered. That realization was both fragile and potent. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It wasn't victory, not by far. It was the raw acknowledgement that I had been betrayed, abandoned, and left to navigate a world that no longer made sense, but that I still could fight to reclaim. And in that moment of absolute isolation, staring at the ceiling, feeling every ache, every pang of betrayal, I made the first quiet, private decision that would shape the next years of my life. I will rise, not because he left, not because the world abandoned me, but because I have to, because no one else can reclaim my life for me. The turning point came unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday. I was sifting through the pile of paperwork from my settlement, medical bills, insurance claims, rehabilitation invoices, trying to organize a life that had been dismantled. My hands ached from holding the papers, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. Then an email arrived. From Isaac, Liam's trainer, the man whose existence had haunted my nights and fueled my darkest thoughts. He didn't know I'd read every detail Liam had shared, or how deeply the betrayal had cut. The subject line was simple: "You should see this." Inside was a series of documents and screenshots, evidence that Liam had been lying, not just about our relationship, but about the affair itself, the money he had tried to claim, and the timelines of his interactions with Isabella. He had also included correspondence showing that Liam had manipulated friends and family, shaping their perceptions to isolate me. I sat frozen, my hands shaking, staring at the evidence. The betrayal had been multi-layered, and yet here was clarity. Proof that the narrative Liam had constructed around me about my supposed inadequacy, my dependence, my neediness, was false. He had chosen deception at every turn. A rush of emotions followed. Anger, yes, but also relief. Relief that the truth existed, that it could be documented, and that I could finally see the situation for what it was, not through the fog of shock, not through the lies of a man who abandoned me. That same week, I reached out to Robert and Michelle, Liam's parents. Years had passed since I last saw them, and I had avoided contact, believing that reconnecting would pull me back into a past I was desperate to leave behind. But now, armed with clarity and documentation, I needed their perspective and possibly their support. The video call was tentative at first. Robert looked older, his hair streaked with gray. Michelle smiled, but her eyes were wary. We exchanged pleasantries, careful and measured. Then I explained everything: the messages, the harassment, the manipulations, the screenshots, and the timeline. Their reactions shifted the ground beneath me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Michelle's eyes softened, but a shadow of worry passed over them. Robert leaned forward, voice low. "Leah, we've tried to reach you over the past few months. We knew she was escalating, but we couldn't contact you. We wanted to warn you." Hearing them, seeing their concern, something inside me solidified. This wasn't just about revenge or proving Liam wrong. It was about taking ownership of my life, reclaiming my agency, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. By the end of the call, I had a plan. I documented everything: messages, emails, voicemails, and surveillance footage from my apartment. I had legal advice lined up. I had allies I trusted. And, most importantly, I had myself, the version of me that no accident, no betrayal, no abandonment could erase. For the first time since the accident, I felt a sense of empowerment. Not vengeance, not obsession. Empowerment. A quiet, fierce readiness to take the steps necessary to protect my life, my independence, and my peace. That was the moment I realized I didn't need Liam's approval, his affection, or his presence to validate my existence. The person who had been powerless, abandoned, and betrayed was now standing, figuratively and soon, physically, stronger than ever. The storm was coming, yes, but now I was ready to face it. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could win, not just survive, but emerge unbroken. The aftermath of reclaiming my agency was quieter than I had imagined, but no less powerful. Liam's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him, and I watched it from a place of hard-earned calm. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once I filed the necessary documents and presented the evidence I had meticulously collected: police reports, screenshots, voicemail recordings, and surveillance footage painted a clear picture of harassment, manipulation, and intent. The restraining order was granted, a 3-year barrier legally preventing him from contacting me, coming near my home, or reaching out through any medium. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the constant dread of intrusion. Meanwhile, Liam's social facade started to erode. Friends who had been swayed by his version of events began to see inconsistencies. His lies, once invisible under layers of charm and manipulation, were now exposed. The whispers that had once worked in his favor turned into questions, then doubts, and finally into withdrawal. People distanced themselves, no longer willing to enable his narrative. Even his family, Robert and Michelle, who had tried for years to balance loyalty and reality, began to step back. They had once worried about Liam, about protecting him from his own mistakes, but now they realized the danger in his behavior, not just to me, but to his own life and reputation. They refused to post bail for his latest legal trouble when he violated probation, recognizing that enabling him any further would only prolong the damage. And then there was Isaac, the trainer, who had been unwittingly caught in Liam's deceit. Liam had tried to manipulate that relationship as well, creating a tangled web of lies and blame. But with documentation and third-party testimony, Isaac cleared his name, severed ties completely, and regained his own peace. Liam's actions rebounded, leaving him isolated and accountable for choices he could no longer hide behind. As for me, I moved forward deliberately. I bought a condo in a building with strict security protocols, installed surveillance cameras, and created a life that prioritized stability, autonomy, and safety. Work remained steady, personal routines returned, and hobbies that had been paused during recovery, like weekend basketball games, resumed. My evenings were mine, reading, cooking, reflecting. I no longer waited for validation from someone who had abandoned me, nor did I allow fear of confrontation to dictate my movements. The emotional fallout was subtle but profound. Every interaction with Liam's past, his family, his friends, his ex-associates, was now filtered through a lens of clarity and self-respect. I no longer felt guilty for maintaining distance. I no longer second-guessed the necessity of boundaries. The peace I had longed for was finally tangible. The greatest victory wasn't in seeing Liam face consequences, it was in my own transformation. I had endured betrayal, injury, and manipulation, yet I emerged unbroken, unafraid, and in control. The truth had a way of rising, and with it, so did I. I left the courthouse, locked the past behind, and stepped into a life that was unequivocally mine, calm, measured, and powerful, not because I had sought revenge, but because I had reclaimed myself. The quiet that followed the storm was different this time. It wasn't empty, it wasn't hollow, it was deliberate, chosen, and deeply grounding. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, and in the process, I discovered something I had forgotten in the chaos of betrayal and injury. My value isn't dependent on anyone else's approval. It isn't measured by loyalty returned or love reciprocated. It exists because I exist. My condo, my career, my routines, they weren't trophies. They were reminders of endurance, of persistence, of reclaiming control over a life that had been threatened by accident and abandonment. I walked through the rooms each morning, feeling the cane under my hand, knowing it represented strength and survival, not limitation. I started to enjoy the small victories again. A long walk without fatigue, a work project completed flawlessly, a weekend basketball game where I didn't think about the past at all. Those moments, ordinary to an outsider, were monumental for me. They were proof that life could be rebuilt, even after fracture. And then there was the deeper lesson. Boundaries are survival tools. Liam's obsession, his manipulation, his attempts to intrude into my life even years after leaving, none of it could touch me when I had clear lines, legal protection, and allies who cared without judgment. Trust isn't just about other people. It's about trusting yourself to enforce the rules you need to live safely. I still think about that woman I was, at 22, naive and trusting, who saw stability in coexistence and love in convenience. She would be proud, I hope, to see me now. I've learned that strength isn't loud. It's quiet. It's deliberate. It's the steady reclaiming of one's own life after it has been upended. As for Liam, the consequences of his choices are his own. I don't need to follow his path. I don't need to watch him falter. My focus is my own story, one of survival, courage, and renewal. If there's a lesson for anyone watching, listening, or reading this on YouTube, it's this. Your life is yours to protect, rebuild, and cherish. Betrayal can break the illusions of love and security, but it cannot erase your worth. You can recover, you can thrive, and you can emerge stronger than you ever imagined. The past doesn't define the future. It shapes it, teaches it, warns it, but it does not imprison it. I am Leah Dawson, and this is my life, reclaimed, resilient, and undeniably mine.